Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Citi, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, jointly organized by the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and CCER of Peking University. My name is Chris Bottiglieri. I'm a managing director here at Citi in our International Franchise Management Group. And today, we're very happy to have well-known economists from China, United States, and from Citi to lead a dialogue on the discussion of China's 2020 economic trends, the reform possibilities that are there, an analysis of some of the key sectors, and what challenges and opportunities are before us in 2020. Citi is very proud to host this event again this year on our premises at our new state-of-the-art renovated world headquarters. We hope you are comfortable and enjoy the morning's program. On December 13th of last year, President Trump announced that the U.S. and China had agreed to a Phase 1 trade deal. Now, business groups from around the United States have widely praised the deal as a positive step. The markets have gone up, but there's still a lot of tension, a lot of uncertainty about the bumpy road ahead. We remain confident that the trade is here to stay. It's just too important to the global economy for this not to work itself through. Whether it's a nation, a region, or a company, populations around the world need that trade to be free-flowing in order for growth. And we here at Citi are supportive of a fair and free flow of trade goods and services and the dialogue like the one we're having today that will further the ends to that means. With a global network that spans over 100 countries and in-depth local expertise in each of our markets, we feel we're uniquely positioned to advise our clients as they think through the evolutionary process of potential future optimization, operations, and supply chains. We have a great partnership with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and we're very honored to be partnering with them again this year to host today's event. Without any further delay, let me hand over the floor to Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations.
Chris, thank you so much. I mean, this is really a wonderful facility, and I'm told this is only the third time that it's been used. So I'm very pleased that we can be here. For those of you who don't know me, I don't see any unfamiliar faces in the audience, but I'm Steve Orlins. I'm president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and it's great to welcome you to now the 11th Annual Economic Forum. You know, year after year we do this, and it always seems when we do it, there's something incredibly important that is going on right around the time of the forum. This morning, as I watched Shanwen, as I watched the evening news from China, I saw the Ministry of Commerce spokesman confirm that Liu He will be in Washington, D.C. from January 13th to 15th, and will sign the Phase 1 trade agreement. He also announced that there is no information regarding Phase 2, which we will talk about today. We're thrilled to partner with Huang and our friends from the National School of Development at Peking University. It is a partnership that really has been terrific in that at a time when governments are not having frank and open discussions, it's important that we have the kind of frank and open discussions that we're having, that we had yesterday, we will have today, and then tomorrow the group will be in Washington, D.C., meeting with parts of the U.S. government. I think everybody here knows the National Committee, but it's our 54th year. We conduct a wide range of programs. We started out with ping-pong diplomacy, and we continue with programs like this today. We've always been at the forefront of what is going on in U.S.-China relations, and we will continue to do that today. As Chris said, we have some of China's best economic thinkers with us today. While the trade war is likely to subside next Wednesday with the signing of the Phase 1 agreement, problems related to restrictions on Chinese investment, problems relating to the expansion of CFIUS, of FIRMA, the entity list, and a myriad of other problems are going to continue to make U.S.-China economic relations difficult, and those are some of the topics we're going to be covering today. You have the bios of all of our guests, so I'm not going to spend time, nor will the moderators spend time going over those bios. But suffice it to say, you are all in for a treat. I want to thank our sponsors today. We have Ernie Thrasher from Xcoal Energy and Resources who are here. We have folks from VanEck Global. We have folks from Chubb, and of course, our partners here at Citi. We have a slight change in the program. Night before last, I got a call from JFK Airport where the moderator for the first part of the program, Michelle Caruso Cabrera, said that she was flying to Lebanon. So I immediately knew what she was doing. She was going to interview Carlos Ghosn, and she, in fact, did do that interview. And those of you who watch CNBC saw that. But we were able on short notice to find the associate editor of the Wall Street Journal, John Bussey, who was here. Where's John? Well, he is here. I did see him earlier. So he will moderate the first panel and is a very able substitute. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to my partner in this enterprise, Yao Yang, who is the Dean of the National School of Development at Peking University. And thank you all for joining us at this critical time in U.S.-China relations.
First of all, let me thank the National Committee and also Citigroup for this wonderful event. As Steve just said, we have been doing this for 11 years. So, some of the U.S.-China exchanges last for several years, but this one has indeed lasted very, very long. And also, I'm very glad to see we have some impacts that we have done in the last 11 years. Steve mentioned the National School of Development. Here we also show we are CCER. So let me just briefly introduce the two institutes. Actually, we started with CCER in 1994. It's a very unique economic research institute in China because all of us at that time were returnees, mostly from U.S., but some also from Europe. And then in 2008, we changed our name to the National School of Development. So basically now we use two names for the same group of people. But we started this exchange using CCER, so that's why I've been keeping this name. All right. The National School of Development is a school in Peking University. Of course, we do teaching, we do research, but we are also a think tank. We do policy advising for the government. Right. So as Steve and also Peter have just alluded, U.S.-China trade negotiation is going to conclude the first phase. So that is going to eliminate many uncertainties. So it's welcomed both in U.S. and in China. But of course, there are still uncertainties about the first phase agreement. For example, how China is going to increase its imports from the United States by $200 billion. That's our hard task. So we can discuss that. And also, what's going to be negotiated in the second phase. It seems like that in the second phase, many tough issues are going to be discussed. And on the other front, China's role in the world economy has been increasing. Right? For example, the IMF study has shown that the last round of economic growth in the world, starting from 2016, had a lot to do with the boom in China, right? And of course, the Chinese economy has slowed down substantially in the last 2 years, and we see that has an impact on the world, right? But on the other front, economic reform is still moving on in China. One of the biggest reform is continuous opening of the financial markets in China. Many American financial institutions have already started to work with the Chinese authorities, right? So that's a big thing in China. Another big reform is to accelerate the reform of the hukou system, so which means urbanization will become a big theme in China in the next few years, right? So hopefully in this forum, we are going to touch upon those issues, right? So as a Euro, I really wish that this forum will contribute to the understanding of the Chinese economy and also to enhance economic ties between the two great countries. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to be the moderator for the opening session. That's a keynote speech by Dr. Xiao. Dr. Qin is the former chairman of the merchant groups, and he also leads the Chinese delegation to the U.S.-China Track 2 Economic Dialogue. And he's also a public lecturer in China. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Qin to the podium.
Thank you, Yang, for your introduction. Very glad to be here to share some of my observations on the new equilibrium in China-U.S. relations. I will start with the global trade outlook, analyze 3 very popular interpretations behind this trade war. And then brief my comments on the Phase 1 agreement and look ahead to the new equilibrium between the two countries. Trump administration has ended the strategic equilibrium between U.S. and China that had lasted for 40 years. Although these two countries have reached the Phase 1 agreement, structural issues remain unsolved. Tensions between the two countries are likely to persist in the future as a new normal. Such a reality is making huge economic and political impact on the two countries and the world, such as the deterioration of economic recovery prospects, disruption of global supply chain, and financial market turmoil. Moreover, many outstanding global issues that need joint effort by the two countries, such as WTO reform, have to be put on the table. Due to the persistent trade tensions and political uncertainties, global economy has become more fragile, with growth slowing down and the downside risk mounting. In particular, global manufacturing sectors is contracting. With all these damages and costs, we need to ask what is the next for the world's 2 largest economies. It is hoped that China and the U.S. can get a new equilibrium, which is more likely a semi-decoupling structure It means maintaining normal bilateral trade, market access, and investment, while setting constraints and obstacles in other fields. Chinese state-owned enterprise investment in U.S. high-tech sectors is likely to be constrained for the national security reasons. U.S. may set up barriers in the multilateral trade mechanism in order to propose the certain conditions hard to meet by China in the short time. Semi-decoupling is surely better than the full decoupling or Cold War. At best, it may create possibilities for the restoring linkage for the two countries in the future. Let me analyze three popular interpretations behind the trade war. The first argument is the Thucydides trap. It refers to the theory that the contest for the supremacy between established hegemony and rising power will inevitably end in war. It seems that the new generations of China policy export in the U.S. and quite a few Chinese people believe that the ancient Greek could have predicted an ultimate fate of China-U.S. relation. However, I do not agree with this argument, mainly for three reasons. First, driving force of modern history is the competition of values and institutions, not military force or war. Law of the jungle should not be prevailed in our time. Second, despite the tension between the countries, multilateral economic and trade cooperation are creating mutual profit. Third, if it is the military force that dominates the contemporary international relations, isn't it justified to abandon the reform and opening up policies and choose hegemonism and militarism? The second argument is about rebalancing the globalization. The last round of globalization has caused the imbalance between nation-state and multinational corporations, between financial sectors and real economy, between those who gain from globalization and those being marginalized. The economic recession of the global financial crisis has made this issue even more prominent. Even the current U.S.-China trade relations tensions also reflect the imbalance of the globalization and the rise of populism. I believe there are some reasons or some truth in this argument and agree to restart a more balanced and inclusive globalization process. Having said that, I do not agree with the rejecting globalization or setting American first as a prerequisite for the globalization. The third theory is the competition of institutions. For the past 40 years, China has formed a government-led model, allowing government directly participate in the market competition. This model has been regarded by some people as the institutional advantages behind the Chinese miracle. In reality, many state-owned enterprises, SO in short, have relatively lower investment returns than private companies, the authoritarian power has sometimes overridden the rule of law. Given the rise of rent seeking, misallocation of resources, and unfair competition between state-owned and private enterprises. These shortcomings began to have a broader impact while China played a more important role in international economy. As a result, China got questioned and criticized. The dispute between China and the U.S. is also one of their consequences. Looking ahead, international market rules, including the WTO reform, need to set clear rules about this issue. For example, the implementation of competitive neutral principle to regulate the relations between the government, state-owned enterprise, and the market. Truly let the market play a decisive role in resources allocation and transforming a government-led economy to a market-led one will benefit both China's transformation and its participation in the international market. That's about market access. Before closing, I'd like to comment on the Phase 1 China-U.S. trade deal. Overall, it's positive because it eases the tensions and avoids the worst. However, it has not fundamentally changed the standoff between China and the U.S. It still looks like a semi-decoupling scenario, and a new equilibrium can only be formed in the long run. It is a good idea to divide the negotiations into phases, from simple to difficult, bring the differences between the two countries into a convergence path. Most of the terms of the Phase 1 deal are conducive to China's economic reform. A commitment to buying large quantities of U.S. agricultural goods and energy is unsustainable and will have negative impact on the free competition of global trade. The U.S. says the Phase 2 will focus on structural issues, but never clearly defines what are the structural issues. In my opinion, China's structural problems are actually institutional ones. And in short, the relationship between the government and the market. This is a question that China cannot get around. We should never underestimate the difficulties ahead. I would like to close my speech with my emphasizing that understanding the root causes correctly should be the very first step before we propose any action plan. As analyzed, Thucydides' trap theory will inevitably lead to a new Cold War, and that's why it should be avoided. Rebalancing globalization theory is more reasonable, but it should be noted that it does not equal to the rejection of globalization and the trade protection. In my view, competition of institution theory explains the causes of most problems we are facing. As for the future, both China and U.S. should make a positive effort. China should continue improving its market system, and the U.S. should deal with its domestic problems caused by its economic policies, excessive consumption, and insufficient investment, etc., rather than just look for reasons from other side. Only in this way can the mutual benefit be better achieved. Thank you.
Dr. Qin provided a very rich framework for us to understand the U.S.-China relations. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but we're running behind the schedule. So let's move directly to the next session.
Well, welcome again, everybody. This is a fascinating topic that we've gathered to discuss. During a week of considerable news, we're seeing security relations in the Mideast recast. We have a presidency under siege. We may be seeing the presidency of the United States also reshape this week. But arguably, the long-term big story that institutions like the Wall Street Journal are covering is this relationship between the two world powers, China and the United States. What is coexistence going to look like? And we're seeing that now defined through the language of trade. Our topic today is in the form of a question: a possible agreement between China and the U.S. to end the trade war? Question mark. I would add maybe a subhead to that: fig leaf or substantive? Another question mark. And today we have a terrific panel, a distinguished panel. I think you have all of their bios already in your material, so I won't go through that. But here to discuss this issue, Yang, Nick Lardy, Catherine Mann, Lu Feng, Daniel Rosen, Shanwen. I'm going to ask each of them to take 5 minutes or so to give us their views on this question. And then I'm going to probably ask a couple of quick questions. And then we're going to turn it over to you to try to have a robust interaction and ask you for your questions to the panel. So kicking it right off, Yang, why don't you give us your perspective on the question that's before us?
Okay. So first of all, my reading of the first phrase agreement is that, after 2 years back and forth, then the two countries finally realized they should go from the easiest to hardest. Okay. So the first phrase resolves some of the easiest disputes between the two countries, and then the second phrase, or probably the third phrase, are going to deal with harder issues. So I want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about a joint statement we issued in last October. That joint statement was signed by 37 economists and legal scholars, both in China and the United States, including 5 Nobel Prize winners. You can find it either on our website or NYU Shanghai website. Right? The basic idea is that we divide the policies into 2 groups. One is beg your neighbor nature policies, and we believe this kind of policies should be stopped. Right? So I think the first phase negotiation or agreements deal with this kind of policies between the two countries. And another group is negotiable policies. Those are domestic policies that have negative spillover effects on other country. All right, so the two countries can negotiate on that. So if they can reach an agreement, that's good. But if they cannot, then the damaged party can take some safeguarding measures to safeguard its economy or society. Okay. And so the good thing about this approach is that it gives both China and the United States some rooms for domestic policy making. As Dr. Qin just talked about, China and the United States have different institutions, particularly on the political side. Right? United States has respected China's political system for quite a long time. I think that's also the basis for the two countries to approach each other. And this way, we can just separate a political issue from economic issue. Right? Likewise, United States needs room for adjustments. I have to admit, in the last round of globalization, China has been the largest beneficiary, okay? And the U.S. Has taken a lot of costs, okay? And the United States needs time to absorb those shocks and also to conduct the domestic adjustments. And China needs to realize that and also give room for the United States to do that, okay? So that's basically our approach. I hope that the two countries will continue down the road to separate political issues with economic issues.
Nick Lardy.
I have a couple of slides. I hope they'll show up. I think when we're talking about the impact of a Phase 1 agreement, what has the trade war meant for the Chinese economy? What's the Phase 1 agreement going to do to the Chinese economy? I want to just address that. I think to begin with, we have to understand why China's been slowing down over the last several years. How important are the economic frictions versus some of the other factors, which I'll just talk briefly about. I think one, of course, is China's external surplus has been declining. The growth in the previous decade was supercharged as China's global trade surplus skyrocketed. And in more recent years, the surplus has been coming down, and that's been a drag on China's economic growth. It's a major structural change, which I think, quite frankly, is a positive development. The second reason China's been slowing down is a moderation of credit growth. China has had a deleveraging campaign. They haven't actually reduced credit to GDP, but instead of accelerating dramatically, it's now leveling off. And as you can see in the diagram, we have credit growth now in the neighborhood of 10, 11% instead of much higher numbers, 14, 15% a couple of years ago, and much higher if you go back to the time of the global financial crisis. So if you have less credit growth, you have a slowdown. And the next factor is related, and that is credit has shifted dramatically in favor of state companies. Private companies used to get quite a bit of support from the banking system. That has changed dramatically. China quit publishing this data. You can see in the most recent year, more than 4/5 of all the credit was going to state companies. China quit publishing this data more recently. But I'm looking now at what's the growth of the assets of state non-financial companies. And for example, if you look since 2012, since Xi Jinping came into power, the assets of state non-financial companies are growing at roughly twice the pace of GDP. So they seem to still have very, very robust access to credit. And of course, that's negative for China's economic growth. As Xiao already showed us, state companies have had relatively low returns, and they've been systematically declining over recent years. Now, the fourth factor is the trade friction, and my view is that the trade friction has not had a very large effect on China's economic growth so far. China's exports this year are roughly flat, but global exports are down. So we're in an environment where global trade growth is very weak, and China's done quite well. So it's managed to offset a huge loss in exports to the United States, roughly 20%, which is its largest market, by selling more in the rest of the world. So the idea that China's slowing down because of trade frictions, there obviously is something to it, but it's not quite as simple as it may seem at first glance. Other people talk about how the global value chains are moving out of China, but foreign direct investment into China is growing at about 3%, which is roughly the same average growth it has been for the last 5 years. And this is in the face of what is close to a collapse of global FDI flows, according to the OECD. I will defer to Catherine on this, but they published a report not so long ago saying that FDI in the first half of this year was down roughly 20% compared to the second half of 2018. So China's holding its own in terms of trade, and it's increasing its share of FDI inflows, which support its domestic economy. So my view is The slowdown is mostly due to the moderation of credit growth, the misallocation of credit, and the moderation of China's external surplus. So the conclusion I draw, which will be my last remark, is that the Phase 1 agreement is not likely to lead to a reacceleration of China's growth or an improvement in China's growth, because I think all the evidence is credit will continue to be misallocated as it has been, which is a drag on growth, and credit growth is likely to continue to moderate. The Chinese government seems very committed to not going back to substantial growth of credit, which creates a substantial financial risk. So my view would be Phase 1 agreement, as other people have said, is an important development, but I don't anticipate that it's going to be a big positive factor in China's economic growth as we go through 2020.
Okay. So the remit that the panel had was a very broad one, and so the decision that I took or the tack that I decided to take on addressing it was to look at the global implications of the U.S.-China trade situation and address that perspective through both the trade perspective and also through financial market perspective. And if there's one word that captures all of the sentiments across both of those real side and financial side, it's that there's no such thing as a bilateral trade war, and it has both real and financial consequences. And so I'd like to just go through a couple of the elements of those consequences. And I guess the bottom line is that a Phase 1 deal, which we don't even know much about, and the financial markets have already embraced, is a fig leaf at best. And we, I suppose, might find out on January 15th exactly what that fig leaf looks like and what implication it might have for the global economy. And I think the bottom line is not very much. And we would have to move forward to a significant degree to reduce uncertainty, to have both financial market improvements as well as real side financial market stability. There's plenty of improvements, as well as real side gains. So what do I mean when there's no such thing as a bilateral trade war, and what are the spillovers, and how consequential are they for the global economy? In a macroeconomic context, we have been downgrading global economic growth throughout this year. We've probably taken off about 50 basis points off of our prospects for global growth throughout the course of 2019. Is that all due to the trade war? Well, I'm not going to say it's all due to the trade war, but it is the fact that trade growth, and it was shown in the diagram in the opening remarks, trade growth, global economy dropped from about a 5% annual growth rate to -3. So that's an 8 percentage point swing in global growth on merchandise trade, which is a dramatic swing and has global consequences, even if China particularly has not been bearing the burden of that. Somebody has, and that is very consequential. The second sort of more microeconomic consequence of a bilateral trade war, which, as I say, has global spillovers, is the tariffs and retaliation. You know, it's all on a product-specific basis, and the retaliation particularly is designed for maximum damage, and it has had maximum damage. So you have reallocation of global supply chains, both in terms of purchasing. We see that in the consequences, for example, of Vietnam's surplus. They may well be named a currency manipulator because they now all meet all three standards on the trade policy report, which also will be coming out soon. Production reallocation, also in terms of FDI. But the third spillover that I think that we ought to consider going forward, particularly in the context of the Phase 1 deal, is what is the shopping list going to look like? The Phase 1 deal is going to have a shopping list. We wrote a note back in March. My colleague Cesar Rojas, who is here, who can answer all the tough questions about these details, we wrote a note back in March on proposed shopping lists, which included agriculture, oil, a variety of auto and aircraft. And the consequences of that shopping list is, first, in the United States, with a very tight labor market, may not even be able to satisfy what's on that shopping list without reorienting exports from a destination to China. And similarly, China will have to reorient its imports from countries that it used to import to the United States. So the spillovers in terms of the shopping list alone could be very consequential to the global economy in the case of not everybody winning out of this at all. And of course, from a macroeconomic standpoint, there's already been a loss. So let me turn now to sort of the financial market aspects of the deal and other spillovers. And there's really three elements of this. The first is we see a lot of reflection in the financial markets of the prospects for trade deals. It's Pavlovian. The markets are Pavlovian with respect to the announcements about deals, the tweets about deals, as well as and how those tweets are reflected in the differential between the S&P and the Shanghai. And we can track what kind of tweet we can expect to see based on these differentials. And we have predictive power now on what the tweet might look like and how the stock market might react. This is not a good situation. This is not a good situation. And on the real side, these tweets, this uncertainty about what might be in the deal has very real consequences. Through several different modeling strategies, we've evaluated what the consequences for markets might be of a continued uncertainty, whether it be manifested in the VIX or whether it be manifested in policy uncertainty variables. And it could, if these uncertainties continue, we could have an additional hit to growth. Now, what has stopped this uncertainty from being manifested in the S&P? We would normally say this kind of uncertainty should be reflected in a deterioration of the S&P. Why has that not happened? Well, what we can show is and we heard it in the statements of the FOMC over the course of the last year. Monetary policy in the United States reacted to this damage to global growth, and incidentally yielded the support or offset the consequences of global growth as reflected in financial markets. And it's not just the 75 basis point cuts that we had during 2019 that is supportive of markets and an effort to offset the consequences to global growth, but it's actually even bigger than that. Because going into 2019, the markets were expecting 3 rate hikes for 2019. In fact, we got 3 rate cuts. So monetary policy, from the perspective of the financial markets, actually was a 150 basis point swing in expectations for policy in the United States. And so one of the spillovers of the trade war has been monetary policy ease and financial market exuberance, to use a word from my former boss at the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, financial exuberance that probably is overdone.
And perhaps this Pavlovian, we'll come back to this Pavlovian slobbering reaction of the financial markets.
I said Pavlov.
Is betting on status quo.
It's betting on more than status quo. It's betting on best outcomes.
Well, let's come back to that. Let's move right on to Lu Feng. Your thoughts.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We all know that almost 2 years ago, then the two countries, China and the U.S., had some difficulties in the trade war. Then I think the two countries, the government, make the observers as us happy twice. Okay, in the May 2018, we almost have a deal. Then it collapsed. Okay, we're disappointed. And in the May last year, we almost make a deal. Then we're also disappointed because situation changed. Now, recently, actually, it's the last month, 13 last month, both countries announced we had a phase one deal. 10 days ago, President Trump tweeted that they will have the signing signature ceremony in this country 18th or 15th, and in a few days later. So exactly maybe 15 hours ago, the Ministry of Commerce spokesperson at Beijing announced the high levels delegation will come to this country, for phase one deal signature. So almost certain now, we will have a phase one deal. As mentioned by our colleagues, and actually we don't have the full information about what's the detailed information about the phase one deal. But both countries announced some limited information, especially USTR give the fact sheets, clarifies certain informations about the upcoming phase one deal. On the basis of that, then maybe we can, and have some comments and the discussions on that. To me, I think, even though the upcoming phase one deal agreement will not be able to reverse the whole situation, evolved over the last 2 years or so, at least, it will present some kind of the very positive impact to recapping, the worsening situation we witnessed in recent years. Also created sort of the new momentum, in shaping the future evolution of the bilateral relationships. So in that kind of the inside of this kind of observation, I would like to say, maybe in 20 or 30 years later, we will recall what will happening now is sort of the milestone in, and the bilateral relationships development. Why I say it's very important for us to have this phase one deal, even though it's not, the complete sort of the reversing of the whole situation. I think maybe there's 2 points I think it's very important. Number one, I think it has created sort of new elements in the whole evolution of the process, to impose sort of capping impact on worsening situation we witnessed over the last 2 years or so. So there's a lot of, I think, elements in that. Number one, you can say, on the basis of the information released by USTR, maybe the new agreement will have certain chapters to deal with all these issues has been highlighted in the so-called the Section 3001 report, investigation report, announced in 23 March 2018. I think all these issues has been addressed. So that indicates two countries, two governments has approached sort of the understanding or sort of the solution, preliminary solution to these issues. Number two, I think that solved the very controversial disputes between these two countries, leading to the current recent year situation. Number two, I think very importantly, also very important is, and it indicates that, we are set off the distribution, China, on China's side, will make some significant amount of the extra purchase of the goods and services and from this country. That will help to some extent reduce the trade imbalances between these two countries, even though I don't think it will eliminate all these kind of the trade imbalances. In my personal view as an economist, I think the trade imbalances, and vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis between China and the United States reflects sort of the complementarity, in economic levels, between these two countries. But at least, and the possible agreements in the phase one deal will address this issue and in a significant way. I think that is also a very important sort of progress. Number three, I think also important, they will set sort of the settlement and the mechanism to have sort of the daily or regular discussion or coordination of the disputes, rather than broke out in the trade war in a tariff and the measures using the tariff measures. So all these kind of the agreements will help to stabilize, how can I say, the two countries' relationships, to cap, further escalation of the worsening situation. I think the second importance of this proposed phase one deal is that it created certain areas of the recoupling, and even deeper integration, and in the economic areas between these countries. Alongside, maybe to some extent, we will still see sort of the partial decoupling. We talk a lot of decoupling, very unfortunately, and in recent 2 years, it happened indeed. For example, in recent, the day before yesterday, this country announced, the government in this country announced they will introduce the new limits in the export of AR-related sort of software. Maybe also targeting China. That is very unfortunate. Maybe also something is inevitable, in the foreseeable future. But very important, if the phase one deal will be implemented, that also means China and the U.S. in economic areas, certain areas, will further engage, will further integrate. That means you will have, and further recoupling. So in future, maybe we will see two parallel processes, recoupling as well as decoupling. Then, dynamic process of these two elements will decide the future relationships. So of course, there's still a lot of problems. For example, extra purchase of the $200 billion in this year and the next year, it will be so difficult on the basis of preliminary calculation by my and my colleagues. That indicates China will increase imports from this country, by more than 70% compared with last year. In agriculture said maybe we have to increase by 80% to 180%, depends which year you will have as a base year. It seems to me it's just impossible. Also it contradicts, there's a discussion yesterday, in the dialogue, it contradicts the United States request from China, to diminish the role of the SOE. Because in order to do that, you have to strengthen the role of SOE. So I think, maybe there's agreement. I think the United States side should have some kind of the accommodative attitudes, more flexibility will be needed, in that regard. On the other hand, I mentioned the settlement and the resolution mechanism. That maybe could be constructive, but also very controversial, because that indicated that each party can take some appropriate action, maybe including tariff action, in the certain circumstances, that makes this action appropriate. That means, two countries' relationships were subject to a lot of uncertainties in future. So saying that, I still think the phase one deal is a positive, successful results. Very important that indicates, even though we have a lot of problems, structural difficulties between two countries in managing their relationships, but if they can further take constructive attitudes, also appeal to the negotiation and the talks rather than only confrontation, I think there's still, way to make a deal, to make agreement, to push forward bilateral relationships going forward. That will be good for two countries as well as for the whole world. Thank you.
And those big imports are going to change how China deals with other suppliers, which is also
that's very important. Diversion facts.
Very complex.
Very
hopefully we'll come back to as well. Dan Rosen.
Thank you. And What a pleasure to be here with this group of folks. We've been getting together for 10 years now and having this conversation twice a year to try to make a contribution to the relationship. So we're at a really important moment now, stock-taking moment. And this panel, we're talking about this deal and how we should kind of score it. You know, how is it? As Catherine pointed out, we can't really say because we haven't been given the text. We haven't been given the terms of the deal. We can, though, I think, safely say this, that this is not a big deal. It's not a very comprehensive deal. It can't be, and I'll comment on that. It is a placeholder, though, and as a placeholder, it can be very useful and very important to us right now if we use it as a starting point to do more comprehensively constructive things in the relationship. So let me flush that each of those points out for just a second. It is not a big deal and can't be a big deal because you can't make a big new deal framework at a time when China has not presently decided what it wants to be. And we are in a special moment past a time in which China had a pretty clear policy package, set of goals, about how it wanted to converge with the market economies, what elements of statism it wanted to preserve, and where it wanted to be more market-oriented. We're now in a time where China is revisiting a lot of those basic assumptions. Not just China, others in the world too are thinking anew about old questions of the balance between the role of markets and the role of industrial policy and things like that. So it's not just a China phenomenon, but it's foremost a China phenomenon. And they're not really in a position in Beijing right at this moment to sign on the dotted line on all the different elements which have become unstable in our bilateral relationship, but not just between China and the US, China and all the OECD economies. Some of the European players are even thinking even more disruptively in some ways than the United States is, believe it or not. So this can't be a big comprehensive deal because the time is not right for it to be so in Beijing, principally, I'll argue. It's a placeholder. Very little of what is in it is new and couldn't have been done in a much less disruptive way using business as usual approaches to policymaking from 3, 5, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago for that matter, the WTO framework as it exists. Donald Trump hasn't really landed a better package of outcomes than could have been done in a much less bellicose, less disruptive way, I would say. We're going to have big reversion back to growth in some U.S. commodity exports, hards and softs, things like coal and things like soybeans and pork. All will go up. They should have been going up persistently over the past 3 years, and now we'll be catching up a little bit. As a placeholder, this won't be bad. There will be some important elements in it. Things like financial sector opening, potentially very important to Citi, are great, but they're being offered by China to firms globally, not just to the Americans. In fact, European and some Japanese players have been able to move faster than U.S. financials are able to move presently because they haven't had home governments that were taking such a disruptive tack on how to deal with all this. So this kind of small ball outcome can nonetheless be a terrifically important opportunity to build momentum toward getting back on track with a more convergent way of dealing with our economic interests together. And all those global affairs that are more than just economic, political, climate change, pandemic disease, all sorts of things that we need to be working together to manage together. This does give us the opportunity to say, okay, the politics can accommodate deal making and being constructive and not just focusing on the zero-sum kind of nature of things. But it's not going to just be counting up changes in the trade balance. In fact, if we're going to talk about the macro more, I think, a little bit on the second panel too, but China's going through a pretty tough adjustment process right now. If it has a weak growth year in 2020, which I think it might, and we continue to hold up pretty strong on the back of very accommodative monetary, as was pointed out as well, then those fundamentals don't augur terrifically for a big surge in U.S. exports to China, quite the opposite, right? So We may or may not be able to score this as a tremendous success just based on the trade flows. But if we have confidence-building measures now, that Beijing takes the signing ceremony moment as an opportunity to show that trying to build leverage by taking foreign nationals into extra legal detention is not the way to build confidence in your market. For example, that pushing journalists further away from the story is not the way to build a dynamic economic crowding in effect that gets everybody excited. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit available to Beijing now that we have a pause in the bellicosity that allows both sides to show that they haven't forgotten what the really terrific opportunities are to be productive and constructive and adult, I dare say, about how we manage this relationship. I look forward to the discussion around some of this stuff, John.
Excellent, excellent. Gao Shanwen.
Just as Dr. Xiao pointed out, I think and I agree the root cause of the Sino-US trade war is a conflict of different economic models between China and the United States. And China had actively pursued market-oriented reform, and that abruptly changed the course after the global financial crisis. Ever since 2008, the government actively, aggressively, and persistently intervened in the economy, as pointed out by Mr. Lardy, which distorted the market, reduced the growth potential with global repercussions. And it's debatable and questionable, even in China itself, whether or not that's the best model for China, whether it serves Chinese people's interests the best. It's questionable even in China. But at least that's partly the result of the policy efforts to fight the long-term economic slowdown. Therefore, it might be ironic that in China, the trade war even has been welcomed by quite some people as a catalyst, as a chance to debate the past policy practice, to build momentum, to build consensus, to restart the market-oriented reform. And in this way, the trade war, on the one hand, the trade war is a tragedy for both countries. However, on the other hand, some people, even quite a lot of people, hope that this may provide a catalyst for China to restart the market-oriented reform, which will serve both China and the U.S. interests in the long term.
That's an optimistic view.
Yeah.
Which let me turn to Nick Lardy to get a response on, because Xi Jinping, if anything, has reaffirmed his confidence in the existing model. And Nick, that's the issue, isn't it? Are we going to see substantive change if the party says, look, it's worked this far, it's worked quite well, there's some hurdles to get over, there's some problems that have developed internal to the economy, but it's working, and it's keeping the party in power, and it's allowing the patronage system to continue. Why change?
I tend to agree with this idea that some pressure from the United States might have been positive for moving China in a more reform-oriented direction, but I think we carried it quite a bit too far, and we're seeing much more of a nationalistic response from Xi Jinping. I don't see much evidence that he's buying into domestic economic reform. Yes, they've cut tariffs and have a little bit of opening in the financial sector, so there's some external reform, but internally we see state industrial policy stronger than ever, the role of the party continuing to be enhanced, particularly at the expense of private firms, which are languishing in the current environment. So maybe, as things evolve, it'll be more positive, but I think in the short run, the trade friction, I think, has set back domestic economic reform in China.
Huang, you also kind of were optimistic in your view of this, that this is a first step, maybe modest, but it capped the tension. It kind of got everybody back on a road to discussion. A cynic might say, after 3 years of pretty tense discussion, this is what we get. China once again kind of buying off the United States, not with Boeing aircraft maybe this time, but some soybeans and promises of substantial other purchases. After 3 years, after 30 years, frankly, of discussion of these issues, and that this interim, very limited deal, if anything, is confirmation that the status quo is prevailing, not that change is happening.
Of course, it depends on which scenario you compare. If you compare wholesale agreement, then, and the two countries solve the old problems and come back to the very the normal relationships, of course, then the deal is not satisfactory. But compare with what happened, what I have seen over the last 2 years or so. It wasn't a situation because yesterday, our American colleagues show us some kind of the polling results, and the mainstream, the society in this country towards China. That result is very discouraging, and it's very disappointing, So in other words, negative attitudes, towards China by the, general people in this country. Because to me, I think maybe a lot of misunderstanding. Also because the situation involved in recent years has been, become very, very negative in recent years. So given this kind of circumstances, given the profound, deeply rooted structural difficulties, so this is why I give, very positive assessment on this phase one deal. Saying that, it just says, okay, maybe, hopefully that will build on sort of the mechanism or new elements, which will, how can I say, expand itself. Maybe phase two, then we can address and more deep-rooted issues. So gradually, I think, take this kind of step-by-step approach. Maybe it's more practical, and in that regard, I think it's still, not ideal, but very useful. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's maybe one of the most major positive results we have been seeing over the last 2 years.
I want to come to the audience in just a couple of minutes to get your questions. So be thinking about them, and we'll have mic runners kind of come to you. But Dan, Rosen, kind of continuing with this notion of where the mindset is in China. Huang just mentioned that relations have gotten worse in recent years, and it has under the Trump administration. It's been pretty confrontative. Tariffs are an example of that. But in your discussions with people in Washington, economists in USTRs, former and current, don't you get the impression that this is a fairly nonpartisan, non-denominational, consistent sentiment in Washington, both among Democrats and Republicans, and very importantly within the business community, the former advocate for liberalization with China, that things have gotten off track, that changes need to be made, and that the problem needs to be confronted, that this is a bipartisan issue. Is China underestimating the sentiment in the United States, thinking that it's just Trump?
We have a former USTR head as the head of our delegation on the U.S. side, and the person of Carla Hills. And so we think a lot about the institutional footprint of this thing in Washington and how that affects how this whole thing has been played out. I would say, John, though, that the whole thing is profoundly partisan, but it's not binary partisan with a GOP and a Democratic take on it. It's unitary partisan. It's a universally useful issue, China, but it's being used as a political cudgel to make political hay, not just by American politicians, but by Europeans as well. And it is a time when, there is a coincidence of what is politically expedient to use the China card, and there happens to be some legitimacy to the complaints and concerns in market democratic societies around the directions that China is taking. The directions China is taking are not necessarily fully compatible with the norms that we use to organize our economy and our politics and our society as well. And I think the best news, and why I too feel a little optimistic about this deal at this time, is that after a couple years of it being verboten, absolutely forbidden to even speak the word decoupling, because it was too much to imagine that that could really be the final outcome, we're now talking a little bit more constructively about the many ways in which our interests are entirely coincident, and we can remain interoperable and engaged and coupled, but also being practical about the reality that different sovereign nations will take different approaches to some of the policy problems of society, economic and political, and that there may arise areas which we're not compatible in, where we're going to have to come up with some sort of different regimes and approaches to managing those only semi-coupled areas, as Xiao said. Partial decoupling is something that I and my colleagues at Rhodium have been pushing for a couple years now, that we've got to get ready for an era of partial engagement, not holding out the hope of complete engagement as we would normally have expected between Canada and the United States, a complete interoperability. That's not necessarily the endpoint that we're going to be managing to. But as I said in my opening comment, it all kind of comes down to what China wants to be when it grows up. China is a work in progress. The U.S. is already a fairly mature state economy at $55,000 or so per capita income levels. China has decades to go before it's finished the development process, and big choices to make that are being debated. And it was fascinating to engage that debate here with our Chinese old friends and colleagues here, of just how many different notions there are inside China about what's the right way to take things. So, yeah.
The right way to take things, Gao Shanwen was talking about the positive impact of foreign pressure. The Japanese speak of the same thing, gaiatsu, the fact that, sometimes somebody asking something of the country or putting pressure on the company can cause thinking to be stimulated inside China. Yang, I'm wondering if you agree with that point, that this is something of value internally to China, that it's creating dialogue within the country, or is it instead causing positions to become more firm and more resistant to change? There's a certain nationalism in China. Why not? Why would the country not respond to this foreign pressure, tariffs, the cudgel, negatively?
Well, Shanwen's assessment has some truth in it, but we cannot ignore the other side. That's Nick said, right? So, on the other hand, U.S.-China trade tensions have also created the rise of nationalism in China. That's also true. I think both are true. But I want to come back, to reform in China. Nick said, China, particularly President Xi Jinping, does not want to have a reform. I don't think so. I think deeply.
You disagree with Nick?
Yeah, I disagree with him. I think deeply, both in Xi Jinping and also in other senior leaders' mind, economic reform, economic opening is still the way for China to go. And we can see there are many reforms that are going on in China, including SOE reform. Right? It's SOE reform actually is quietly conducted. Okay, so mixed ownership has been proposed as a way to reform SOEs for many years, but you can see in the last several years it has been accelerated. I think this year is going to be further accelerated. So a reform is not stopping in China.
Let me just conclude with my questions, and then we'll come to yours, Catherine Mann. The markets certainly have responded to this monetary easing, and that's the macro force. I'm thinking that the markets are probably not a good indicator at all of what's likely to happen on the trade front, because they're responding very incrementally to the daily tweet, as you point out. And that what we have seen is, in fact, an affirmation of their belief that the status quo will prevail. Uncertainty's taken off the table. The trade war is, for lack of a better word, over. And it's what we had before is going to continue into the future.
Well, I think you have to make the distinction between the financial markets interpretation of the trade situation and the real market's interpretation, business's interpretation of what's in this deal or what's not in this deal. And you might say that the uncertainty is off the table with regard to the financial markets, but the uncertainty absolutely is not off the table at all with regard to the real side of the economy. And as I say, the analysis that we've done in looking at the consequences of continued high uncertainty with regard to policies, trade policies among others, but that's certainly a dominant one, continues to have damage on the real side of the economy. And so this gap, this widening gap between the financial market's interpretation of the real economy and the real economy's assessment of its own self, that is a very wide gap, a very wide disconnect. And at some point, the two of them converge. What has prevented them from converging down, from financial market converging down to the kind of the situation in the global economy over the last year has been the prospects for an actuality of monetary policy ease, and of course in some emerging markets of substantial fiscal ease as well. So in terms of policy responsiveness, that has been there to offset the damage associated with the trade war. How far that can go on further is a question. If there are not underlying improvements in the real side of these economies, particularly on the manufacturing and investment side, then the financial markets are going to have to come down to earth, and that creates its own uncertainty and turbulence, to which perhaps there has to be again monetary policy response, and that's our big question for 2020.
Let's go to your questions. Just raise your hand, tell us who you are, and we'll get a microphone to you right here to start off with.
Thank you. My name is Richard Black, Executive Intelligence Review. My question is directed especially to our guests from China, and it's on this question of China's mindset. It's well known that when Premier Li Keqiang was the head of his province, he de-emphasized focus on GDP numbers and looked at measures of economic growth such as electricity use per capita, housing availability per capita, came to be known as the Li Keqiang Index. At the same time, we watched China from the large, and China has put 35,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in motion, lifted 850 million individuals out of extreme poverty. These are extraordinary real economic developments. My understanding is that the Central Economic Work Committee has also discussed moving away from GDP targets and instead looking at a different metric for economic growth. Rates of innovation, changes in living standard, the degree to which there's harmonization of the industrial base with the ecology. So the question is, in fact, is China not moving towards a Western approach of, let's say, China becoming junior advocates of Milton Friedman and von Hayek? But is it possible that China is actually developing a new paradigm of economic growth based upon physical economic development and the development of the population.
Why don't we give that to our economist from China, Shanwen? Would you want to try to field that one?
Yes. I think the poverty reduction, and the environmental protection have been among the focal points of the new policy paradigm, among others. However, the economic development is still very, very important because, relatively speaking, China's per capita GDP is still not so high. So economic growth is still very, very important to the government. And the other point is that maybe some people have observed in the past 2 years, the central government has worked very hard and issued document after document, policy directive after policy directive to boost private sector, to boost private firms, because it's a consensus that the private sector is too much squeezed, because the state is overstretched, because the efficiency of state sector is not so high. However, it's overstretched at the expense of the private sector, which alarmed the top leaders. And I saw the new momentum has been built up to pursue and deepen economic reform, to systematically, persistently boost the private sector firm. At the same time, the trade war broke out. So in that sense, first of all, the economic model is self-defeating. The economic model of the past year is self-defeating. The state is overstretched. The financial risk is being built up. The growth potential is being reduced. And on the other hand, the private sector is too much squeezed, which alarmed everyone, at least the top leader. And we have to separate the propaganda and policy decision-making process, because they are two different things.
I think it's very interesting. Actually, I think there's two issues. Number one issue is how to observe or measure the current situation of macroeconomic performance. Indeed, Li Keqiang, when he was maybe the governor of the Liaoning, he invented or highlighted, three economic statistical indicators, as you mentioned, electricity, credit, as well as railway freight, as sort of the combined sort of index to measure whether at a given point of time, economic situation is good or bad or is normal. That invention was coined by Professor Huang Yiping, here as Keqiang Index, has been got a lot of discussion and attention. And another issue is maybe also involved is how to assess the importance of economic growth in China, measured by GDP growth in China. Actually, that kind of the approach has been involved a very significant change after Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, and become the leaders, over the last few years or so. Generally speaking, the current government highlights the high quality growth. A little bit playing down the importance of the GDP growth rate, not only too much emphasis on GDP growth rate. I think it's correct because, as someone mentioned, when we're in a new developmental stage, maybe we need to, pay more attention to quality of the growth, rather than to search, seek for too high growth of the GDP. But saying that, actually, China is still a developing country. GDP growth, per capita GDP this year last year may barely, $10,000. Compared with the past, it's huge achievements. Compared with this country, we still, have a long time to go, as Dan said, we still a few decades to go to catch you or catch other developed countries. So we still need a reasonable, sustainable growth rate. So nowadays, because the economic growth has been slowing down to maybe a little bit worrisome levels, now I think policymakers now give more priority to economic growth, stabilize economic growth. So I think we should have a balanced point of view to that issue.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Hello. Hi, so my name is Lizzie. I'm a journalist at Mirror Media Group. The question I want to ask is directed at Mr. Yao Yang and Mr. Nick Lardy. So I wanted to reopen the debate on state versus market a little bit. I know you guys sort of differ on your views on that, but I also wanted to highlight, at the turn of the new year, the Chinese side, posted those two policy initiatives. First, there's the 28 point on supporting private industry, 支持民企28条. Then there's the 3-year reform plan for SOE, 国企改革3年方案. Do you think those policy initiatives are real in their intention to open up the economy, or are they for pure signaling values to international audience or domestic audience? So I just wanted to have your takes
Nick,
on that.
Nick, why don't you take that
Okay,
question?
well,
we'll move
on this question of the state versus the market, I would say, for example, with respect to the first reform that you mentioned, the support for the private sector, as somebody already mentioned earlier, there have been dozens and dozens of statements from top leaders in China over the last few years about the importance of the private sector, the need for it to play a major role, and the importance of banks and other financial institutions being more supportive. The problem is it's very hard to see that this has produced much in the way of results. And I think, as several people have already mentioned, I think Mr. Gao in particular, that the private sector is still very squeezed. So I think the intention is good, but the reality seems to lag behind. And I would say the same thing with respect to this plan to reform SOEs in the next 3 years. SOE reform in China has been going on for 20 or 30 years. It's been very, very slow. And some of the things that are being, as Yao Yang mentioned, are being re-emphasized, like mixed ownership, which is a reform that started in the mid-1990s. And if you looked at Dr. Chin's diagram or my diagram, it has not produced very much results in terms of increased productivity of state companies. So maybe there's some hidden sauce that we can't quite see that's going to transform state enterprises in a very short period of time. I'm skeptical.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Jose Ocasio-Christian with Kalis Foundation. One comment, one question. First comment is, if I was in Shanghai and I told another economist that we got to figure out what China does when they grow up, the Chinese would tell me I've been trading for 3,000 years. So, Mr. Run, when China grows up, I think we got to look at that. But the question is, as these trade policies go into effect or have been going back and forth, whether it's a policy or activity, in other research we've done, we've seen that there have been some informal relationships or groups that have maintained that relationship through those periods, that have been able to maintain some, like we said, or like some of you said earlier, some semblance of connection. In the last year, or as you see in the future, are you seeing any groups or markets that are informally working together to hold the line until this is all resolved? Or is it something like yourself, ma'am, where Citi says, I'm going to take an initiative to maintain the connection with China? So any elaboration on which relationships you've seen or markets that are maintaining some semblance as this continues?
So there are a couple of different strategies for continuing engagement at the corporate level, both within multinational corporations that have deep engagement with production in China to serve the Chinese customer. That type of relationship, I think, has been continuing onward, and as in fact that's a relationship that is founded on the advantage of being in that market. That is true for financial relationships as well. It's an important marketplace. and it's one that has a very long history, and it's one that has a potential for greater growth. So, there's even as there is disengagement on some levels associated with the trade and tariff war, and certainly, and we've only scratched the surface here. We did not talk about the entities list. We did not talk about the disengagement on the financial side that has been proposed in certain legislation with regard to the ability of pension plans to invest in indexes, which include some Chinese companies. I mean, that's proposed legislation, and it's a complex issue. And so we have only touched the surface in our discussion here, but certainly at not just on the real side with multinational corporations, but on the financial side as well. Definitely deep engagement and continuing engagement in countries that are important markets for further growth. You don't give up on growing markets, or you shouldn't.
We also haven't gotten into CFIUS, though there's a question right on that. But on the trade front, from our reporting in the trade negotiations, the tone is being set at the top. Other questions? Did I see one in the back there? Yes, right here, this gentleman raising his hand.
And I have just one question. Nobody responded, particularly from American side, very clearly to one point made by Dr. Yang Yao in the beginning. He mentioned that it needs to separate political issues from economic relations. For instance, I just want to hear frank opinions from American side on this matter.
Who'd like to field that? Dan?
It's already happened to some extent, right? We've started applying a different kind of screen to foreign participation in the U.S. economy, in research circles, in investing in a lot of industries. Traditionally, the United States maintained really the most liberal approach to global participation in our system, in our economy. And we are now revisiting that and applying some of the less permissive approaches that others in the OECD have used. There's things like net benefits test. Is it really in the interest of a given industry in America to have a lot of Chinese participation or other from other parts of the world as well? So it's a reality that the United States, long an advocate for a kind of hard separation between economics and politics, our revealed preference at present out of Washington is to admit some combination now of our economic security and our political security being commingled. I'm a very liberal-minded economist, and so I think that that's not going to be a very productive direction for our policy thinking to take. But we will see. There are many points of view on this in the world, some of them represented in China and among our colleagues here. Catherine and I have worked together on these issues for 20 years, for instance, back when we were back at Peterson Institute decades ago. So it is just a reality that these things are getting mingled together and that there's no easy playbook for how you neatly separate them apart so that we can embrace maximum money-making without feeling squeamish about the implications of an authoritarian alternative model being very heavily represented all around the world now.
Yours is a very excellent question. I would just say that whereas Dan says that there's some commingling, I'd say that there's substantial commingling now. But Nick or...
Yeah. So I think that while I agree that there's a lot more commingling now, I think that the nature of some of the new technology-based industries, particularly associated with cross-border data, and how those data are treated from the standpoint of privacy and security, makes this political economic mixture much more challenging. And as the data becomes a integral part of both services production as well as industrial production, you cannot get away from this commingling, which makes it much more difficult to have a separation. And it makes the consequences of the commingling reach ahead in terms of who you're going to let in and who you're not for joint activities. You're going to hit that question at an earlier stage going forward. Now, the end game, unfortunately, looks very nationalistic. If you can't trust the inward, then that also means those guys out there are not going to trust you going outward. So it becomes industry, services, production, and data collectively become very fragmented. And you do end up with this question of how much fragmentation can the global economy really absorb at low cost. And I think that we've already seen a lot of fragmentation, and it's been at very high cost. So I think that going forward, there has to avoid high cost of fragmentation going forward, there's going to have to be some development of mutual understanding agreements or something, because the cost of fragmentation on a data-dependent basis is going to be extremely high.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid.
Respond?
Sure.
That's important, right?
We're just a little bit over. Yeah.
Right, I understand. This is a very important issue, right? I think in the last 40, 50 years, in most of the periods, the separation of politics and economics was one of the strong foundations for U.S.-China relations, right? Unfortunately, it's changing. I agree that nowadays it's very difficult to separate the politics completely from economics. But the danger is that if we don't draw a line, we have this wholesale mingling up politics and economics. Then there's a danger that you're not going to find a bottom line, right? Where are you going to stop? Yep. That's the serious issue, okay? Even in terms of data access that Katrin just talked about, I think there's a way for both countries or all the countries to sit down and negotiate a rule for data flow across the border. Of course, China has some limitations for data flows. But even taking that, I think there is still room for negotiations. So if the United States wants to mingle politics with economics, I want to suggest that you should have an itemized approach, not a wholesale approach. That's going to make things much easier.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Before I send you to your coffee break, and a reminder, 10:45, right back here for the next panel. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel this morning.
Let's reward those for being on time, so let's start. First, sitting in this venue, I see our city representatives are not here, but I just want to thank Citi for giving us what is truly a terrific venue for this. And I want to thank again Cole for supporting this, and Chubb and Van Eck Global for doing that. Now, is John back in the room, John Bussey? But he really did a great job moderating, and in fact has set the bar very high for me to moderate this, as he's really a professional, and we deeply appreciate his jumping into the fray on 48 hours notice to substitute for Michelle. This panel is intended, obviously the first panel was focused on the U.S.-China trade issues. This one is much more focused on the macroeconomic situation and the future of what is going to be going on, what we think is going to be going on in China. Obviously, the first panel touched on a lot of the issues that we're going to be discussing on this panel, but we've got a stellar group here. to talk about these issues, so let me not use, and I'm not going to go over their bios again because you have the bios in the written materials, and let it just suffice to say that they are terrific. They are all people I deeply respect, and when I have questions about Chinese economy, I call them. So let me start with Wang Xun.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I'd like to talk about two things. One is the growth potentials, and the other is growth drivers in the future. And the first thing, growth potentials. We know, according to the growth theory and empirical evidence, the per capita GDP of opening economies tends to follow the similar law of convergence. That is, the lower the poorer the economy was at the initial period of opening up, the faster it will grow in the following decades. And under the basic assumption of successful convergence, we made our projections of China's future growth potentials. And here are the main results. Number one is the output gap has been negative. According to our projection, the growth potential in 2019 is 6.7%, but actually the growth rate in less than a year should be 6.1, according to the market estimation, including the IMF. So I think a combination of expansionary monetary and fiscal policies can be expected in this year, in 2020. And number two, from the short term to long term, the potential GDP growth will decline gradually from 6.9% in 2015 to around 3% in 2050. And number three, the per capita GDP of China relative to that of United States will grow from 24% in 1950 to around 65% in 2050, according to the medicine database. And number four, China's share in the world economy will approach 24% in 2050. And the second thing, the growth potentials. Number one is that we find openness, especially the trade openness, is the precondition for developing countries to narrow the gap with leading economy. Because, the openness actually provide the basic opportunities for developing countries to access technology spillovers from the leading economy. And that access is vital for the poor countries to take off. And it's also important for developing countries in the process of opening up to strengthen the protection of intellectual property rights, which will help create sort of institutional environment conducive to innovation and technology transfer. Number two is that we find the aging population is increasingly constraining the sustainability of China's economic growth, and the related burden on pension system will be a big concern. And the third is that the urbanization and the accumulation of human capital will be much more important in the process of successful catch-up in the future. And we find that these two cannot be accomplished separately, because cities usually are the centers for intellectual interchange and the recipients of technology influence. And the human capital actually is important to the ability of adopting and absorbing appropriate technology. But usually in the developing countries, a higher fraction of the population is in rural area. For example, at the very beginning of China's opening up, 82% of the population was concentrated in rural area. And the human capital actually is less than half that of the United States, and only 55% that of Japan. And until now, we do have much rooms to be improved in these two areas. And lastly, I'd like to talk about the policy implications. Actually, I think at least there are three. The first is that China should first open up its economy, both to domestic private capital and foreign capital. Number two is that we should enhance the transparency of domestic policies and the protection of the protection of IPR and also private property rights in China. And the last but not the least is that I think China should take some measures to facilitate the intermobility. Such measures should include elimination of hukou system and birth control policies and improvement in the education system, especially for the migrant workers' children, and improvement in the social security system. Maybe I just stop here.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And I want to talk about a few words about China in the year 2020, in this year. And I think that China, the GDP growth in China in year 2020 is likely to be stable. And the GDP growth, my forecast for that is 6%. And you know that the GDP growth declined in last year. And I think the GDP growth in year 2019 is likely to be 6.1 or 6.2%, which is lower than the 6.6% growth in year 2018. And to a large extent, I think that the decline is due to not to the trade war, but to the harsh deleveraging policy implemented in the last 2 years. Because of the deleveraging, the credit growth, the total social financing in China slowed down significantly and led to a credit crunch in the real economy. And private enterprises was particularly hard hit in this credit crunch environment, and that's led to the decline of the economic growth. And in year 2020, you know that China is expect to achieve the so-called building up a welfare society goal. And in order to do that, China should double GDP by the end of year 2020. And so I think that the policy stance in this year will be more towards the maintain a stable growth, and this more friendly policy environment will boost the economic growth. And the second point I want to make is that I think Chinese policymakers still have ample policy ammunition to maintain a stable growth. And for example, the debt. And I know a lot of people are worrying about that there will be a debt crisis in China in the coming years. And to me, I think this debt crisis is just a myth. And the reality is that China is quite healthy in terms of debt level. Let me give you a few numbers. That according to the Bank of International Settlement, the overall debt to GDP ratio in China is about 260%. And the average ratio of the debt to GDP, the average debt to GDP ratio of advanced economy is about 670%. So China's debt to GDP ratio is lower than the advanced economy average. And not to mention Japan, the debt to GDP ratio in Japan is about 380%. And don't forget that China has a very high saving rate. The saving rate is more than 40%, and which is twice as the average of the other countries. So given the huge very high saving rate, and I think relatively not that high debt level, I think China still have ample room to increase its debt to GDP ratio. And I think that the Chinese policymakers will use that room to maintain a stable growth. Actually, if you want to maintain a stable debt to GDP ratio, the best way you can do that is to have a decent growth. And if you have too much debt, the best way out is to grow out of it. And I think that is China's policymakers will do in this year. I will stop here.
This doubling, what is required for GDP growth in 19 and 20 to reach the doubling?
Well, if you want to double that, we need 6.2% GDP growth in year 2019 and year 2020. But there's a trick because...
So 6.2 in both years, you would meet the goal.
But you know that China had the fourth economic census conducted in last year, and it is a common practice to revise GDP numbers after the census. And so I think, according to the past experience, and GDP growth in the past several years will likely to be revised up. So that means to achieve the doubling goal that we may not need GDP growth, and 6.2, maybe 6% is enough.
I actually saw somebody estimated 5.6 this year would still be sufficient.
Still be sufficient. Mm-hmm. Is there any way that China...
I'm not saying they're suggesting we should target this 5.6.
Is there any way that anyone on this panel believes that China will not meet these goals? It's a facetious question.
That's a very tricky question.
It's not. The answer is they will meet the goals.
No, we're pretty confident.
We're pretty confident. I would say 100%. It's great to be back at City for you, Yiping, right? They didn't have such a beautiful facility in the years you were here.
That's right, yeah. It is quite nice to be back in this building after more than 10 years. The issue I want to talk about is the financial sector reform and opening. I guess by now you all probably would agree that the Chinese economy is entering into a new phase of development. And the financial problem appears to be growing. One of the very common description, even in the policy document, that is repeatedly saying is that finance is not supporting the real economy. And you could see some of the symptoms like financial efficiency is declining over time, risk is rising, and the private sector finding it increasingly difficult to obtain funding. So all these issues like all compounding together, and it looks like it's a big challenge going forward. If we look at what is happening in the financial sector, some of you probably would know at the beginning of economic reform, China only had one financial institution, which is the People's Bank of China, but it has commercial and policy functions both in one institution. Today, 40 years later, you look at the financial sector, it's gigantic in terms of number of institutions, size of the assets, and so on. But the government still maintains relatively widespread and a serious intervention into the financial system, what we call in academic work called financial repression, meaning the government still intervenes. And that often is a cause for criticism, both at home and abroad. But I think we need to look at these government intervention from more practical perspective. And I think, number one, it is a transitional phenomenon because we started from the central planning system, moving toward the free market system. So on the way, you will see some remaining government intervention, and I think that's understandable. The second reason is also we actually did some academic work, including one with Wang early on. We found actually government intervention under certain circumstances was helpful for supporting economic growth and financial stability. The reason is if the free market mechanism is not well developed, particularly if the regulatory framework is not mature, simply opening up, liberalizing, and let go would actually create more problems than bringing benefit.
like what we observe in many emerging market economies. The financial crisis is very often. In China, maybe resource allocation is not perfectly efficient, but it's very effective supporting growth and maintain financial stability. So I think there are good reasons, but obviously we need to go ahead. The reason why we're having problems at the moment is because the economy is entering into a new phase of development. In the past, we just rely on the low-cost advantage and the low-end manufacturing, so it's more like a simple expansion of the economic activities. Now we need to rely on more on innovation and industrial upgrading. And by the way, most of the innovation in China is done by the private enterprises. So the financial system that is regulated, highly intervened by the government, dominated by the banking sector, found it very difficult to deal with these new innovative private enterprises because they don't have good financial data. They don't have fixed assets to serve as collaterals, and often they don't have government implicit guarantee. That is one of the reasons why we are finding it very difficult. There are lots of money around in the economy, but it's just difficult to channel from financial institution to the corporate sector. This is one area we are seeing a lot of reforms. But also innovation. I don't have time to elaborate. The fintech development really is leading the world and supporting the SMEs. So I think on the one hand, we need a further liberalization, reducing the government intervention. You probably saw that PBOC is pushing ahead with liberalization of the interest rate for the commercial banks. That I think risk-based, market-based risk pricing is also very important. The other thing which is probably more relevant for the audience here is the financial opening. I actually coordinated a project in 2017 on the China Finance 40 Forum. We brought together a large group of experts and officials in China looking at various aspects of financial opening policies. At the same time, when the State Council was working on its own agenda to open the financial system. So last couple of years, I'm sure you saw some activities and policies taking place. At the end of the last year, the authorities again announced a new policy document called 11 Articles about financial opening. And we're actually seeing concrete steps moving ahead. So you probably heard some of these. For instance, Nomura and JP Morgan are already on the way getting their securities licenses. The American Express is also in the process of applying for some kind of clearance services PBOC is processing at the moment. PayPal is also getting into the payment institution in China by taking some stakes in the domestic economy. So on the institutional front, you find the government is significantly reducing the limit, the opening up for foreign financial institutions to get into the country. At the same time, on the market front, you also heard the Chinese debt market already entered, for instance, Bloomberg, Barclays Global Market Index, also the JP Morgan EM Index, and so on. So certainly it is opening. The Standard & Poor's rating agency is already operating in the Chinese debt market, and the authorities also recently removed the limits on the quota for the QFII and RQFII and so on. So I do think these are all happening. Whether or not they are happening fast enough in order to maintain strong growth and maintain efficiency again, that's something we need to watch. But I'm confident and I'm optimistic that we are moving in the right direction.
Can you look out? In other words, we are seeing kind of green shoots in financial liberalization, that we've waited 18 years for this opening and it is actually occurring now. Can you look out 10 years and think about, I lived through the Big Bang in London. I've seen financial markets that have opened globally. When that happens, U.S. institutions, whether it's Citi or Goldman Sachs or our hedge funds, tend to play very important roles. If you look out 10 years from now, do you see American institutions playing an important role in China's financial services markets?
Well, I certainly think foreign financial institutions, particularly the American financial institutions, will play a much more important, a greater role than it is today, probably compared to the other places as well. But I'm not 100% sure it will be comparable to the London market, the European market you mentioned. I think certainly for now, China is still a developing country. The kind of opening and the kind of the accommodation of foreign institutions probably will still be quite different. I mean, I think Japan is a good example to look at. I think the Japanese financial system is probably open by definition. But if you look at the de facto entry, the presence or participation by foreign institutions is still not comparable to the European market. My own take is that in the perceivable future, that importance will significantly rise, but I think it will still way behind what we hope that one day will achieve London's level.
Barry.
So let me follow up on what Yiping just introduced us to. I think absolutely the good news is there's movement again, right, in the area of institutional reforms, many different institutional reforms, not just opening to foreign financial institutions, although that's an important part of it. And so this is a big deal because really when we look backwards to about 2005 is when we saw the last really large-scale domestic economic reforms in China. And since then, that's more than a decade, we've seen a pattern of sort of disappointing proposals of reform, but if they get risky, they're sort of pulled back. And so, it's not an exaggeration to say that reform stagnated for a decade after about 2005. And now we start to see movement again. So that's really important. It's a really big deal. We even see it with respect to state enterprises. That is to say, has been a set of very slowly working through changes in the state sector. One of the questioners at the end of the first panel asked about the 3-year action plan for accelerated state enterprise reform from 2020 through 2022. So that's all on the cards. And if we were to say what's going on with these reforms, probably the simplest way to think of it is as a increased financialization of the state sector. In other words, instead of having state firms be directly subject to government bureaucracies, they're increasingly holding companies with financial incentives that are placed in between the government level and the enterprise level that is designed to take these state firms, corporatize them, in most cases list them on the stock exchange, and in many, many cases attract additional investment so that the ownership becomes mixed and the joint shareholders should be able to agree on financial incentives rather than other kinds of success indicators. So all of that's important. It represents significant change. Now, is it going to work? Is it going to actually make a difference? I would say at this point, we have to be very cautious and maybe even somewhat pessimistic. And the reason for the caution and the pessimism is that these institutional changes are taking place in an environment not only of increased politicization in China, that is to say, under Xi Jinping, the need of everybody to follow the Communist Party, to integrate Communist Party leadership into state-owned enterprises is constantly being stressed on the news media everywhere, and it really affects the incentive structures of managers in state firms, et cetera. And in particular, the imperatives of trying to drive the growth model towards a higher tech, more innovative growth model means that the government is asking state firms and asking private firms as well to consciously shift their activity towards development of new technology industries. Now, of course, in a lot of cases, it works well. Right? FinTech is a great example where China really is leading the world in the adoption of decentralized, convenient, cashless payment systems. It's really impressive. But at the institutional level, it means the government's constantly pressing firms to adopt non-economic motives to try and pioneer and popularize new technologies. And so it means there are these two conflicting objectives where the government's telling state firms, go ahead, look at financial indicators, but not completely. On the other hand, we want you to serve as the driving wedge of this high-tech drive. And I think maybe later we'll talk about technology as one of the key friction points between China and the U.S. But just to think about the domestic aspect, government missions are being given to firms, even as the firms are being told to be independent and to make profit at the same time. So I think for those reasons, until there's a little bit of a, if there ever is, a step back on the part of the government in its desire to guide and drive firms, then we're still going to have to be cautious about the economic impact of these reforms.
Okay, great. Wang Ming.
Yeah. Today I want to share a very recent reform agenda. It's about the urbanization reform agenda that was just announced last week, and I think it will have a profound effect on China's future growth. So before mentioning that reform, I want to provide some basic facts about China's growth in recent years. So actually, in the past several years, consumption has become the dominating effect for economic growth in China. So look at the consumption growth. In 2018, the total GDP growth rate is about 6.6%, and the consumption is about 9%. So here's the number. So consumption contributes about 77% of GDP growth in 2018, and the capital investment contribute to about 32% of GDP growth, and then net export negatively contribute about 9% of the total GDP growth. So from this number, you can see that the consumption becomes the dominating growth driving force. Okay, and of course, there are many factors that can affect the consumptions. For example, many people are concerned about the aging. Okay, people will say that aging, Chinese population aging will have some negative effect on the consumption. But on the other hand, we also see many positive things happening. For example, the e-commerce. So e-commerce actually boosts the consumption by substantially reducing the transaction cost in the consumer market. And another issue is important factor is urbanization effect. So when we are talking about the effect of urbanization on the consumption, actually there are two effects. One is the income effect. So if one person migrate from the rural area to the urban area, their income will be increased. And on the other hand, from the household level data, we can show that for the two families in the rural and the urban, they have the same income. The consumption ratio in the urban will be higher than the rural counterparts. So here's the number we calculate from the household survey data. So think about two families. One is in the rural, the other is in the urban. In each family, the per capita income is between 10,000 and 20,000 Chinese yuan. The urban family, the consumption ratio is about 97%. But the rural area, the rural family, their consumption rate is about 74%. So that means even without income change, just a migration from the rural to the urban, the consumption rate will be increased. That's because in the urban you have more options, consumption options. Okay, then let's look at the number of the urbanization rate in China. So in 2018, the official number for the urbanization in China is close to the 60%. But among those 60% of population in China that living in China, around 23 million rural migrants, they don't have hukou, or in other words, you call it urban citizenship. So if you don't have hukou or urban citizenship, you cannot get the service from the social welfare, including public education, Medicare, and the Social Security. So think about this. So this is about the size of population, about 2/3 of U.S. total populations. Those people, they work in the cities, and their family members, their kids, their wife or husband may living 1,000 miles away, and they temporarily work in the cities, and their home 1,000 miles away. So in such a situation, they will not make an investment in the cities. So and basically, this is mainly caused by the hukou system. So even their kids come to the city, they cannot get to the public education service. So last week, so actually the central government announced a very important reform agenda. I think it's the hukou system was founded in the early 1960s. So it's the first time in the last 6 decades the central government decided to eradicate the hukou system. So according to the reform agenda, it said that for the prefectural cities, if the metro population is less than 3 million, you should, accept all the rural migrants and provide them hukou or urban citizenship without any conditions. At the current situation, most city government will have many requirements for those that apply for the urban citizenship. For example, the number of years you work in the cities and the education level. Most cities only provide hukou with highly educated rural migrants, with a bachelor degree. If you don't have a bachelor degree, it's very difficult for you to apply for the hukou. But now, for the prefectural city with population that less than 3 million, no conditions. So that's very important. And for the metro population between the 3 million and the 5 million, relax the conditions. And for the population above 5 million, is kind of improving the current situations. So in China, we have 293 prefectural cities. And for the number of cities with the metro population above 3 million, only 17. That means most of the cities in China now is completely free up. So they will provide the hukou system, hukou to the rural migrants without any preconditions. But of course, this reform will cause some financial pressure on the local governments, and we still need to see and what's going on. But anyway, so this actually sends a very important message and signal to those rural migrants. Now you can have the hukou, okay, and you can live in the city permanently and benefit from the social welfares. So that will, and your kids, if you bring your kids from the rural area to the city, they can, benefit from high quality public education in the city. So that will, make them make an investment in the cities, and that will have important contribution to the consumption as well as the economic growth in China in the future.
Okay, I'll ask a few questions, and then I'll allow the audience to ask some questions of the panelists. First, we didn't really discuss much about AI, big data, 5G, some of the areas where the perception in the United States is that China is actually ahead of the United States, and it's going to have major implications for economic growth. Somebody want to talk about what the implications are for China's advancement in AI, China's use of big data for economic growth over the next 10 years? Briefly, I know that's a question we could do 4 days on. Any volunteers?
Okay,
why don't you go first? And then
I can give a few words about that. I think the conventional wisdom is that China has competitive advantage in this low value added, low technology and sectors of the industry supply chain. But I think that has changed. Okay, for example, let's take one example. There's the innovation. You know, in the latest data we can get is for this international patents granted, number of patents granted in this year in 2018. So United States, the first is the number one in terms of the patent granted. The total number is about 56,000.
All patents or patents related to AI?
All patents.
Yeah.
And that was 1% lower than the numbers granted in year 2017. And in year 2018, the number of international patents granted in China was about 53,000, which is number two, and which is 9% higher than the number in 2017. So according to that trend, I think it is very likely to be the case that China will be the number one in terms of international patent granted in last year, in year 2019. And if the trend goes up and goes on, and I think that China will have much higher number of international patents granted than the United States. And I think that reflects an important change. The China, in the past several years, we have college students about 8 million every year. And this kind of low-cost, high-skilled labor has built up China's competitive advantage in innovation, in R&D. And so this 5G, this AI, I think that is some instance reflects this megatrend. So I think in the years to come, China will have huge advantage in this front, and so I think that factor gives me confidence in China's sustainable growth in the coming years.
So I mean, there's absolutely no question that's true. Absolutely, China is closing the gap with the United States. But we still need to separate this into sort of scientific and economic aspects, right? Scientifically, still the U.S. is ahead in almost all of the key scientific areas, including AI and including the core technologies in 5G. But where China is doing a superb job is in the integration of the technologies and the actual economic impact. So fintech is a great example. The fact that China already has a 4G network throughout the countryside means that people who are still relatively poor are able to start up businesses, go through Taobao and other online marketplaces, and bring a new boost of development to people who are in really relatively isolated places. So I would say, even though when you look at tensions between the two countries, it's typical to sort of focus on the high-tech sectors because that's where the uncertainty is so great and the strategic issues are so important. But if we're looking for the economic impacts, the really big story is the integration of the broad Chinese market, low-cost Chinese consumers, and these new technologies, which mean people can be networked at a pace that we've never seen before.
Of course. Go ahead.
Well, I think Barry's observation is probably correct. I mean, we have lots of patents. These patents are probably different from those patents from the developed countries in terms of the technological ladder. But that also reflects our development stage. To some extent, I think your worry about the technological competition might be a bit overdone. We may have some good companies really at the leading edge of the global technological progress, but we're still $10,000 US GDP per capita country, and you're way above $50,000 US dollars. The gap. Number one, we won't be able to be competing at the forefront all with you. And for us, the most beneficial progress is that we improve on what we're doing here and moving ahead. But related to the AI and to the new technology, we did find one area, for instance, the blockchain technology. There is a list of the number of patents created by different institutions. Alibaba is way ahead of most of the other institutions in the world for the last 3 years and so on. And that big data is applied for practical financial purposes and is working pretty well. I just give a quick example, then I'll stop. As I said earlier, financial institutions are having difficulties to extend the finance to these private enterprises because they don't have the usual credentials to convince the bank that I can get your money. But what is happening now is we have a number of online banks, the My Bank of Ant Financial, WeBank of the Tencent, and there's XW Bank in Chengdu. The three banks, each of them are extending around 10 million loans every year. They don't even see the customers, but they are keeping the non-performing loan ratio somewhere around 1%, which means they're doing pretty well. The reason why they're able to do is because of looking at the digital footprint, using the machine learning and so on, create a new kind of credit scoring system. We are doing some work with the Bank of International Settlement and International Monetary Fund and so on. We produced a number of papers just to show, number one, it works. Look at the performance of these banks. They actually do better than the traditional bank approach. The reason is because, number one, you look at a more up-to-date number. Number two, you're relying more on behavior data. These are relatively more stable. And number three, the machine learning approach enables you to capture some of the nonlinear relationships. So compared to the traditional banking approach, it is actually much, much better.
Yeah. I mean, this raises the question of so you mentioned Alibaba, Tencent, and they've been very successful in developing these applications. History in the United States tells us that when government funds basic R&D, it works. So, in the United States actually is moving in the wrong direction. I believe we've moved from 1.1% to 0.7% in funding basic R&D, which is bad for American competitiveness. But in China, hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent trying to develop industries. So, right. For instance, what has been spent on the semiconductor industry? $500 billion. And basically, low-end chips are produced that you could buy out on the street. It's not very successful. So is that going to be a drag on China's economic growth, this kind of belief that the state can fund these things, but all it really does is it creates excess capacity?
Well, I think, like Barry, I'm worried about our industrial policy, but for very different reasons. My worry is that we are spending so much money, they might not be actually productive in terms of creating new patents. Because we had a number, for instance, to show that of the all domestic patents, 70% are contributed by private enterprises. 25% contributed by foreign firms, only 5% contributed by SOEs. So if the government is spending money, massive money on innovation, like Barry suggested earlier on, giving lots of resources to SOEs, as a Chinese economist, I'm so worried that we are wasting lots of resources. I think it would be much, much wiser to spend some money on the basic research. If you look at some of the Chinese companies that you guys are worried about, these are doing well in leading the advancement in technology or in economy. Most of them are all private owned. So I'm worried, but for a different reason.
Well, and in fact, it's going to get worse, right? Because as part of this 3-year state enterprise action plan, expenditure on R&D is a success indicator for state firms. So they get higher bonuses if they spend more on R&D. And, I think we should always keep in mind how ambitious Chinese plans are. First of all, China invests 40% of GDP every year. So a lot of money's going into stuff. And when we think about cities, as you were talking, this very interesting liberalization of hukou policy is very important. But remember, that goes along with plans that say we're actually going to cap the population of Beijing and Shanghai and build new regional clusters, new regional urban clusters tied together by high-speed rail. Wow. That's expensive. It's ambitious. It might fail. Yeah. But on the other hand, it might work. And so, we, outside China, we should be paying attention to these initiatives because they're really, really bold.
I always enjoy moderating because I get to ask a lot of questions. I want to do what I call the lightning round. So I just give you one sentence to answer each question. I'll ask several questions, then I'll open the floor to questions. Next 10 years, biggest risk, one sentence. Biggest downside risk.
Yeah, actually, for me, the biggest risk for China actually is the downside risk in the economy, and all the risks actually are correlated with the downside risk. But for me, actually, the most prominent risk actually is in the financial sector. And
one sentence. Okay.
Just one sentence. The main risk, I think, are two. Actually, the government doing too much, and the government doing too little.
有矛盾.
I would agree. I think a potential financial crisis would be devastating.
Barry.
Agree, but specify. We now have $1 trillion of government-run investment funds that are being bulked up. If these go wrong, that can trigger financial crisis in a way that we haven't thought about much.
Wang.
Yeah, so in the last year, I traveled to Ethiopia.
One sentence.
Columbus, yes. And in this country, we can see there are a lot of social stability issues and a lot of social conflicts. So that worries me about social stability, yes, in China's future.
Second question, what's the big upside potential? What's the biggest kind of upside potential? I'll start with you.
Upside potential, I think China, we have large populations. So that means large market. The large market can, help sustain the AI or this technology R&D investment. So that's very important. And also can sustain a very comprehensive industry systems.
Okay. Yeah. Barry.
I already said mine. If these new shape urban forms really work, watch out.
I think you look at the Chinese experience. Basically, if we can let the market to work and allow entrepreneurs to play a significant role, most of the Chinese economic problems can be resolved.
Okay, I think the economic growth finally boils down to one factor, people. And I think in the coming years, in coming decades, the biggest potential that China has is this massive number, high skill, low cost labor.
Yeah, the upside potential actually for me is process urbanization and the accumulation of human capital. Urbanization and the accumulation of human capitals.
No one mentioned what is my best upside potential, which you can all guess, is the United States and China recognize that working together creates more economic growth than confronting each other. And the effect that will have on GDP growth will be absolutely enormous in both countries.
That's my base case, Steve.
It's not my base case, sadly. But let me open the floor to questions. Bert, let's start with Bert Keidel here, who everybody knows.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the National Committee for this terrific panel. I wanted to ask, both in last session and this, there seemed to be quite a bit of emphasis on the supply side in the economy, whether there's efficiency in state-owned enterprises. And yet we've got, without taking account of pork prices, very low inflation, and growth has sort of ebbed to a low level that some people have compared with the late 90s. So to what degree is that sort of blinding us to what the upside possibilities are? And in terms of the second half of my question, a source of demand is the urbanization that Yang first brought up in his opening statement. And is the financial systems, regulatory system, capable of handling the financing that will be needed for the scale of low-cost housing and other investments in the urban area without having that money squeeze out into the waterbed effect of high-end speculative financial uses? So, one, is there an upside if we look at the demand side, rather than focusing so much on, supply side so-called problems? And would this urbanization do it if, and is the financial sector regulatory system capable of keeping the money going to the public sector destinations that are such an important part of urbanization? Thank you.
Okay, I can answer that question. I agree with you that I think the main constraint faced by Chinese economy is not the supply side factors. I think insufficient demand is the main problem. When you have the insufficient demand, actually, it is relatively easy to create demand. The ultimate case, the extreme case, is proposed by Keynesians. You can just hire people to dig in holes in the ground and fill the hole. And I believe that building infrastructures and building houses in China is a much more productive way than digging holes. And I think China, in terms of that, China has ample room to maintain a decent growth in the coming years. And I believe the Chinese policymakers will use this room to will use this ammunition to do that. And But in the past 2 years, I think the main problem in China is that the policymakers they do too much. They did too little. They didn't provide enough. They didn't create enough demand in the economy, and that led to a vicious cycle in the economy, and led to the decline of the GDP growth, the economic growth. And I think things has moved back to the right track in recent months. That's why I believe that we will have a stable growth in the year 2020.
I will offer a slightly different opinion. I think the reason why the government now is focusing more on supply side policy is because you look at the last 40 years, whenever the economy takes a downturn, the government stimulates and the economy goes back on the same track. Now, last 10 years, the government has been trying to repeatedly stimulate the economy. The economy continues to go down. And one of the reasons is, I think, there are many reasons why it's going down. There are some trend reasons. But I think most people would recognize the efficiency is declining. So supply side reform, the main purpose is really trying to improve efficiency. And for me, whether or not the supply side reforms are successful, I think I would look at the productivity. If productivity starts to improve, then the economy can continue. Demand is very important, but remember, demand can only be sustained by income growth, and income growth is supported mainly by your productivity growth.
And for me, the urbanization actually is a natural process, and I think government can do two things. One is, to improve the facilities of the infrastructures in urban area. And the other thing actually is to, relax the direct constraints on the financial markets. Actually, just back to the AI or big data or R&D, you know that all of these industries actually are more external financial dependent. So if we really want to direct more resources or investment in this kind of industry, we should develop, besides the digital finance, we should develop the direct finance, the financial market.
Well, I think given the 40% saving rate, I think China do have enough resources to build up all these structures, infrastructures, and low-cost housings.
Other questions? My eyes don't go that far. There we go. Yeah. It looks like Paul Clifford there. Is that Paul?
Paul Clifford, Harvard Kennedy School. I'd like to focus a little bit on SOE, state-owned enterprise governance, as opposed to ownership. I think it's a very important point, building on what Professor Naughton was saying. I think over the last 7 years, we've seen the Communist Party come back into SOE governance in a way that it wasn't there over the last three decades, affecting everything from strategic decisions and bonusing, even within listed parts of the SOE. So this is, I think, a really quite an important development. Before I get to my question, I'll just give you an example. One large, especially large, Terda SOE had negotiations and successfully merged with another Chinese company. Having done the negotiations, the chairman of that company was dismissed by the Communist Party because during the negotiations he had not discussed politics, 没有讲政治. In other words, he hadn't discussed the role of the party, and he was dismissed. He's a fine man, I know him, but he's gone. So when we look back at the IPOs that happened in the around under Zhurongji's period, and I was part of those, I helped. The goal was to create some separation from the party, and also to raise funds. I think the effect was that a lot of other people's money was used, but it didn't create a great change in the corporate governance. So pretty well everybody talked about the new mixed ownership. Again, I think that is confusing governance with ownership. The ownership is really another way of using other people's money, private sector maybe, but it doesn't transform the ownership. So my question would be, in this year and next year and the next 5 years, what trend do you see in SOE governance, a reduction or an increase in the party role?
I think clearly we're on a track towards increased party control. I mean, if Xi Jinping wakes up one morning and changes his mind about his whole political orientation, maybe that would change, but this trend is so powerful. Now, we could say that there is a certain amount of rationalization in the corporate governance system of SOEs. So the board of directors plays a stronger, more clarified role, but the party secretary is typically the chairman of the board of directors. So I think it's a very serious problem
for SOEs. Anybody disagree with that?
And we might even say that increased party control is also a problem in private firms, including Alibaba.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, is what are the implications for private firms to have party participation in the board of directors?
That's not my understanding, that the party is participating in the boardrooms. I think the private enterprises are all going to set up a party committee, but that's separated from the governance of the enterprises. That's my understanding. So I think that is probably a separate issue.
And the implications of that? Having a party committee in all both foreign and domestic organizations in China, including those that are totally private.
If they are separate from the boardroom functioning, then I think the impact on direct management of the company would be limited, if not zero.
But with the best firms, with Alibaba, you've got an interaction, I think, between party influence and industrial policy. So Alibaba is sort of, they're given incentives, but they're also under a certain amount of pressure to conform to government industrial policy. So they take stakes in some very promising firms. Maybe they would have done that anyway, but they're also aware that furthers the government objective. They set up open innovation platforms where they are supposed to share some of their technology with other firms. So I think they're in a much closer embrace with the government than they were, say, 5 years ago.
The person in front of Paul Clifford, I can't down here, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Noah Silverman from Societe Generale, and this is for the panel. Is there any concern over the level of local government debt, especially in second and third tier cities? And if you do have concern, do you see a situation where the central government would possibly take on that debt? Thanks.
Well, I think that there is only one government in China, and all local governments are just the branches of China, of the China's central government. So I think that it is impossible to delineate local government debt from the central government debt. And I believe that in the end, all this local government debt will be serviced by the central government. If the local governments cannot do anything, you cannot service that debt. That's one point. Another point is that, I don't think that local government debt is a big problem. Well, if you look at the infrastructure, at a microeconomic level, yes, this local government borrow money at the cost like interest rate at 5 to 6%. To build infrastructure investment project, which can only generate rate return at 2%. But these projects carried out by local government are mainly public projects. They generate externalities. They generate social welfare. So if you look at this project from a macroeconomic perspective, I think the rate return on this investment projects are pretty decent. So the government, they can use the other sources, for example, by selling their land to reap the return and to repay their debt. So I think the local government, the Chinese local government, they do have a unique business model. So borrow money, build up infrastructure investment, and get the return by selling land to repay their debt. So I don't think that the debt is not that, the problem is not that big.
So, I did some study on the local government debt in last year. So actually, last year when the third tier city government come to us, they want us to do some consulting service for them on the local government debt. So I'll give you just a number for this case. So for this city government, their total tax revenue in each year about 2 billion. And this money is only make to fund the operation of the government, but their total debt is about 70 billion. And supposedly the debt should be paid back based on the land sale revenue. But last year, the total land revenue is about 3 billion, and it's just pay back the interest rate. So that means now the land revenue cannot pay back the debt. So it will be a concern for the local government debt in recent years. And I think it's not just one case. I think many second and third tier cities, they have similar problems. And in the last year, they did a lot effort to solve this problem. Now they are starting to selling the SOEs, and they are starting to get the financial support from the upper level government, the upper level government is a first tier city. They now their financial finance is pretty good, and they can allocate some money to help them pay back. And of course, and you look at the number. So in China, we have two kind of different types of SOEs. So one is the industry firms, like including China Commercial, and the major another part is type is called local government platform. And the main problem of that is local government debt coming from these local platforms. And that mainly was used to invest a huge investment in infrastructure. But look at the numbers. Actually, the total asset of the industry firms is much higher than the local debt. So the number is about 90 trillion Chinese yuan, and the local debt is at about between 30 and 40 trillion Chinese yuan. So eventually, the central government can be the last resort for the local government debt. Yeah.
This panel started a few minutes late, so I'll let it run a few more minutes right here.
Hello, I'm Susan from China Business News. A question about China's GDP growth. Right now, China is already the second largest economy and already have 30 years of 8% growth. Is it natural for China to think that 5 or even 4% GDP growth is normal? And what makes China so obsessed with the 8% and now 6% of GDP growth? And if China can accept a 5% or even lower GDP growth, does it mean will increase the investment efficiency?
Well, my take is I don't think that people are still obsessed with 8% growth in China anymore. It's a very difficult, it's a tough change, but it changed. People now feel 6% is good. But again, there is a question if we're willing to accept this lower than 6% growth. My own sense is that we probably should focus on some of the key indicators that are important for economic development. And two of them, to me, number one is the unemployment rate, and number two is the financial risk. If these two indicators are stable, then we probably shouldn't worry too much about growth. Growth is important, I think everybody agrees. But Wang mentioned earlier about our forecast, our study on China 2049. Our prediction is that by 2049, our GDP growth rate probably would go down to somewhere 2.7 and 4.4%. So growth continue to slow down. It's harder to avoid. It's just when the level of economic development rises, the growth rate comes down. That's a universal phenomenon. For us, I think what is important is to avoid sudden and dramatic decline of growth. That would certainly be more important than look at a specific level of growth at one particular year. That's my personal take.
What's puzzled me recently, I met with a bunch of auto manufacturers in China late last year. And auto sales and auto parts sales are down double digits. It's not a question of slowing growth, but depending on who you were talking, in case of Ford Motor Company, they were down. Their joint venture was down about 20% year on year. Others were down in the teens. How do you was it President Eisenhower who said, as GM goes, so goes the U.S. economy? Now, that's no longer the case, but it still plays a major role in the U.S. economy. How do you square those auto numbers with 6.2%?
Actually, it's true that auto sales declined visibly in the past 2 years. And I think several factors are playing roles behind that. One is that, yes, because when you have a slowing economic growth, you naturally have slowing sales in almost everything. And another factor, important factor, is the government is winding down the subsidies provided to the auto auto industry previously in place, and that also led to the decline. But in the meantime, we should look at the property market is relatively in a good shape. The property investment grew by about 10% in the last 3 years, and that has helped the GDP growth to in a kind of relatively stable shape. And so you have slowing auto sales, but you have booming property market, and that they offset each other, I think, in some sense.
So just the one compliment.
I'll ask if Xiao wants to make closing remarks.
Okay. So Xu mentioned about the property market. Actually, I mentioned that now in the city there are about 23 million people from the rural migrants. They don't have hukou system, and only 20% of them buy the house in the city. So that means 80% of those rural migrants, of the 23 million, don't buy any apartments or houses.
230 million.
Yeah, 230 million.
230 what?
No, 230 million rural migrants living in the city, and 80% of this population don't own any house in the city. I mean, so now because of the hukou reforms, in the future there will be a big demand for the local cities property.
We're going to need to call Xiao. Are there any closing remarks you would like to make? Well, I think we'll just have people, rather than just come on up to the podium and...
We'll just stay here and take photos.
Yes, we'll stay here. And
This has been a very exciting and kind of a short morning. I hope you have learned something useful from the two sessions and also Dr. Qing's keynote speech. 2020 will be a very interesting year in both the United States and China. There will be a lot of things for us to observe. So I hope this forum can provide useful information for you to digest this year's changes. So let me take this opportunity again to thank the National Committee, particularly Steve, for this long-term collaboration, and also thank Citi for providing this very wonderful facility, and also other sponsors, particularly EXCO. Ernie has been here all day here. Thank you all. Thank you for your attendance. Bye-bye.